back to Inclusive Leadership. We are taking a look again at voting rights this week. We are in week 2 of our 3-week series, and today we're going to talk a little bit about the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And you'll see a picture down in the bottom right of Martin Luther King and LBJ having a conversation after the signing of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. So last week we talked a little bit about the voting rights movement in America, when the very beginning of voting rights, who had them, who didn't have them, etc. And this week we're going to take a little bit of a look at how the movement changed in 1965 and the events that surrounded that movement in Selma, Alabama. And you'll see the Edmund Pettus Bridge is on the right side of your screen, and that is where many Black and brown folks marched from Selma to Montgomery, Alabama, exercising their right to peacefully protest so that they could earn the right to vote, because there were so many ways in which they were unable to vote, which we talked about last week, and maybe you heard a little bit of that during Fannie Lou Hamer's speech that she gave to the DNC. All of those things were limitations, how Black folks were being disenfranchised and unable to vote. And so, that is a picture, I believe, of the 50th anniversary not too long ago. And that bridge is still named the Edmund Pettus Bridge. And you can visit there and experience Selma and all of that it has to offer. I actually was just there in March, and it's actually a really fascinating place to be. So I definitely recommend it if you haven't been there. And then next week we'll talk about challenges that are affecting voting rights today. So I encourage you to stay active and stay plugged in as we explore this topic. So just a reminder of those guiding questions that we talked about last week. Be considering, does voting matter? Why were these people willing to risk their lives so that they could get the right to vote? And what are some reasons that people don't or can't exercise their right to vote today? Because I know we all know people who don't choose to exercise their right to vote. We know people that can't exercise their right to vote. Most of you that are listening to this don't have the access to the right to vote and can't exercise the right to vote today because you're underage. Some folks we know don't have access to the right to vote because they're not citizens, even though they've lived in America most of their lives. So something to consider there. What is significant about the right to vote? In what ways have students made a difference in the right to vote historically, and what can they do today? What does it take to solve and heal deeply ingrained injustice? Is the right to vote still secure? How might current campaigns in the U.S. learn from Selma and its aftermath? So those are the questions I want you to be considering. And I wanted to talk just a little bit this week. Something that we didn't chat about last week is why, as leaders, is it important for us to understand voting rights? Well, number one, your voice matters, just like the image on the right says. Voting is a really powerful way to lead because it allows citizens an agency and it allows them a voice that represents them in seats of power. So when you can exercise your voice in order to put people in places of power, that is very powerful in and of itself. The second piece is voting is one of the few ways that we can inform our system of government and our system of leadership in America. And so your voice matters because it allows you to have influence in the area of leadership and governance of your community. Number 3, understanding the history of disenfranchisement. Remember that big word disenfranchisement means lacking access to vote, allows us as leaders to see when and where we can leverage our voices to advocate for people who don't have access to the right to vote and maybe don't have access to other things as well. Like, for example, a farm worker that immigrated here from Mexico who has not yet received their citizenship has no agency and has no voice to put people in power who can advocate for them. And so there is a particular responsibility for those of us who do have the right to vote to leverage that right to advocate for the people who don't have a voice so that they can have that at some point. And number 4, voting is a way to have agency in our country. While it cannot change everything, and I hear that a lot from my friends, from my family, that their vote doesn't matter, or it doesn't have impact, or they don't have influence, it can't change everything. That is for certain. But the leaders we elect and the laws that we pass collectively can change a lot. I'm going to give you a couple examples of that. The power of the citizen voice. Why vote? Well, in 2008, citizens elected the first Black president of the United States of America and changed history forever. In 2018, that's not that long ago, it's 2 years ago, Colorado citizens made an amendment to their constitution, removing the exception to slavery for criminals. So there was a part of their constitution that still allowed slavery for criminals. And they were able to amend that in 2018. Colorado citizens did that. In 2019, Washingtonians voted against affirmative action policies that would have directly given access to public colleges and universities, given more access for minorities, as well as more access to loans for minority business owners. And so, yeah, I mean, I certainly don't agree with everything that citizens vote on, but having the option to exercise your voice and your right to vote is a right for a reason, and everybody deserves access to that right. And it's because it has power, and there is influence in that right. And you know, I love the image on the bottom right that says "Why vote?" and then within it, it says all of the areas of influence that, as a voter, you have authority over, and that includes poverty and creating laws that help folks get out of poverty. That includes simple things like filling potholes and leveraging our tax dollars to do things like that. In addition to how our government money affects people's jobs and crime and schools. So yeah, those are all things that the right to vote has leverage and has power over. And so the right to vote is really important for leading in your community. So we are going to take a look at the Voting Rights Act of 1965 today. This was a huge milestone for African Americans, specifically in America. So I want you to go ahead and navigate over to selmaonline.org, and I want you to go to Chapter 6 called Presidential Support. The screen should look like this. So you'll click in the top left. There's 3 little lines up there of that screen. And then I want you to click on Chapter 6 and go ahead and go through and complete Chapter 6. And then I want you to come back right here. I'll give you a pause to go ahead and do that. Okay, welcome back. So I'm sure you took away a lot from walking through Chapter 6. What I took away from Chapter 6 and from an understanding of the Voting Rights Act of 1965 is, number one, the act banned the use of literacy tests, which was a really big deal. Number 2, it provided federal oversight of voter registration in areas where less than 50% of the non-white population had not registered to vote, which means that in those particular counties or in those particular communities, less African Americans had been registered to vote, and that told the federal government that maybe they didn't have access, and so there was a need for the federal government to have oversight over that voter registration process to ensure that Black Americans were not being discriminated against by use of literacy tests and other means. Number 3, the Voting Rights Act of 1965 authorized the U.S. Attorney General to investigate the use of poll taxes in state and local elections. And that just means that the U.S. Attorney General was able to then also have oversight over the use of poll taxes, meaning people had to pay to vote in state and local elections. And so the U.S. Attorney General, through the Voting Rights Act, was able to investigate those things and ensure that everybody had equal access to the right to vote. So some effects of the Voting Rights Act. There were a lot. And so I'm going to direct you over to our Microsoft Teams channel and go ahead and take a look in the voting rights files. And you'll see 2 documents that I want you to look at that have graphics on them. Number 1 is the percentage of registered voters in the black voting age. And that's just to determine the percentage of registered voters among the black community based on their voting age. And then the second document is the population and number of black legislators in the South during those periods of time. And that directly correlates to the access that black Americans had to voting, which we talked about last week when we were talking about the history of the voting rights movement and how right after the Civil War, as soon as black males had access to the right to vote, how then the number of black legislators soared in the South. And then how that later decreased is what you'll see reflected in the document. So then in your journal, I want you to go ahead and complete the activities from each handout in your journal, summarize the activities or the effects of the Voting Rights Act and what the effects that it had, and then I want you to answer this question. Would you say that the Voting Rights Act has been successful? Why or why not? Based on what you're reading in those two documents. So what we know is that the Voting Rights Act was reauthorized in 1970 and 1982 and 2006, following the Voting Rights Act in 1965. In each instance, Congress looked at evidence that showed that African American voting rights were still in danger. So, for example, the Voting Rights Act would come up, and then in 1970, 1982, and 2006. And some folks would try to argue that it was unconstitutional or that it was no longer necessary for the federal government to have oversight over these different communities and their voting processes. And in each instance, what this is arguing is that no, that those voting rights were still in danger in those states that were identified in the original 1965 law. Sorry, I'm having a hard time speaking today. So then in 2009 and in 2013, the Voting Rights Act faced challenges again at the Supreme Court level. So now I want you to navigate over, there's two videos that I want you to look at, and I've linked them in the Microsoft Teams posts page. I want you to watch those two videos that talk about the Supreme Court, the challenging of the Voting Rights Act in the Supreme Court. And I want you to answer these questions in your journal. Number one, why was the law challenged at all? On what grounds was it challenged and why? And number three, did the Supreme Court uphold the law and with what reservations? Okay, so go ahead and do that and come back. And then we have another challenge to the Voting Rights Act, which was successful in 2013. This challenge is known as the Shelby County versus Holder Challenge. So I want you to go to Voting Issues Today. That document, again, is in the Voting Rights Files tab in on our Microsoft Teams channel. And I want you to consider, number one, what is pre-clearance? What is the pre-clearance requirement of the Voting Rights Act? Number two, what would constitute as evidence that the pre-clearance requirement of the Voting Rights Act had indeed accomplished its purpose? And its purpose being equity for all for all to have the right and access to vote. And then what would constitute evidence that it had not accomplished its purpose yet? And number three, what are the potential consequences if over time it is revealed that pre-clearance has not accomplished its purpose? So go ahead, take a look at Voting Issues Today, answer those questions in your journal. All right, I know that was a short video for today, but I really wanted to make sure that you had an opportunity to get into those documents and check out some videos as well, because I know listening to my voice in a PowerPoint isn't that engaging, so I hope that you're able to engage in some of those extra activities. And next week, we're going to talk about current challenges to voting rights in America as of 2020. And if you're interested in learning more about the events that took place in Selma, Alabama, I highly recommend that you watch the movie Selma. It's available online. You can stream it on Amazon, YouTube, Google Play, iTunes, In addition, if you don't want to spend your own money to watch it, there will be an opportunity for us to stream it as a class virtually later this month. So be on the lookout for that. And I will see you next week as we continue our voting rights series. Thanks, y'all.